All right, so taking a look at Paul's letter to the church at Rome here today. And as we get started doing that, I'd like for you to just take a look at Romans chapter 1. And let's begin reading in verse 18. I'm going to be reading from the New American Standard Bible that's in your pews there. And Romans 1 and verse 18 is on page 1012. Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. I thought about asking the question, what was Rome like? What was Rome like? And I thought about letting you answer that question. We could do that. But I think if you'll read Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32, you'll get an idea about what Rome was like, especially the pagan and Gentile population in Rome. It says in verse 18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so they are without excuse. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. But they became futile in their speculations. Their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. And therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so their bodies would be dishonored among them. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. And for this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. Their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but give hearty approval to those who practice them." What was Rome like? Well, in the Gentile population, the pagan population, if you were to study Rome, if you were to study about Nero, if you were to study about some of the people connected to Nero, you would find that a lot of things that Paul is talking about right here in Romans chapter 1 were the very things that Nero himself was practicing. Let me read you a quote from the 12 Caesars for a minute. We're going to go back to Romans here in a moment, but I want to read you a quote about Nero. This is from page 160 of the 12 Caesars. Nero was probably the emperor who was in power when Paul writes to the Romans and says this: "All emperors were the targets of an infinite amount of sexual gossip. But in Nero's case, the rumors reached unprecedented heights or depths. They credit him with a remarkable versatility. He was said to have gone to bed not only with perfectly normal, good-looking young women, but also with his mother Agrippina, with men older than himself, with eunuchs and with young boys, including Britannicus, while graffiti on the walls of Pompeii included an inscription by a male prostitute alleging that he personally had served Nero's lust on 4 occasions. The tradition is so persistent there was probably something in it. Permissiveness, after all, was the spirit of the age. Indeed, the emperor himself was said to have assured his friends that it was all nonsense to suppose that anyone in the whole world was sexually chaste or pure in any part of his body whatever. And the only reason, he added, why this had ever been believed of anyone was because they managed to hide what they were doing. Nero, the emperor, committing the acts that Paul's addressing in Romans chapter 1, when he talks about men acting with men and doing things that are unnatural. Doesn't name Nero there, but it perhaps was known that these were some of the things that he was engaging in. Now, you might think, well, was it any better with the Jews? That's just the Gentiles. Certainly there was a good old Jewish population, but look at Romans chapter 2. Turn back to Romans chapter 2, and then take a look at what Romans chapter 2 says. As Paul writes, he addresses the Gentiles in Romans 1. He addresses the Jews in Romans 2. And in Romans chapter 2, we'll start in verse 17. We'll just look at a little snippet from there. He says in verse 17, if you bear the name Jew and rely upon the law and boast in God, and know his will, and approve the things that are essential, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of the immature, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and of the truth. You therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. He addresses the Gentiles, he addresses the Jews, and so we're talking about, as we think about what's going on in Rome, we're talking about a culture that was incredibly sinful, and yet there were a few Christians there that he writes to. Let me give you one more snippet out of this book. This is from Clinton Hamilton's commentary on the letter to the Romans. He starts out by saying this: the letter of Paul to the Romans came into a society that was in a morally deplorable condition. No doubt the signs of decay for heathenism as well as for Judaism were most evident. The moral condition of the Gentile world, as depicted by Paul in Romans 1:18 through 32, is graphic and sad. The contentions of the Jews on the one hand and their conduct on the other hand were not consistent. And as men observed both of these segments of the human family, there was an obvious need for some more certain guidance in the moral and spiritual realm. And it was into such a world that the gospel of Christ came. All right, so that's our introduction to Rome and to Romans, and we're not studying the epistle to Romans. That would be take a lot more time than we have to cover tonight. But I wanted to use some of that for you to think about who Paul's dealing with as he writes to Rome. All right, let's take a look at our PowerPoint here. I'm going to show you some map work here in a moment, and then we're going to. What's the building on the right there, the structure on the right? Colosseum, all right. Who's been to the Colosseum? I know some people have been to the Colosseum here. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I was going to say, Ed and Pat, raise your hand. I know you've been there. So we've got 5, 6 people that have been there and toured the Colosseum in Rome. Well, Rome was considered the prize, Ethan Longhenry writes. He says, during New Testament times, Rome was the center of the known world and the capital of the greatest empire known to that time. All roads and shipping lanes led to Rome. With about 1 million residents, Rome was a vast city, the major commercial and political center of the day. Every belief, every superstition and idea ended up in Rome, and Paul greatly desired to preach the gospel there, both to the citizens and to the rulers. Let's think a little bit about Paul's conversion. When he was converted, what did Jesus promise about the future preaching subjects of the apostle in Acts 9, 15 and 16? Who's he going to be preaching to? He's going to be preaching to Gentiles. That's going to be one of the subjects. And so Rome was a great place to find a large segment of Gentile population, for sure. Who else? Kings. Kings, and all who are in authority. And the king of the Roman Empire was in Rome. And Paul was going to get the opportunity to preach even to the Roman emperor, perhaps, as he was tried in Rome and as he made his appeal to Caesar. And so there's two major cities that are noted as places where Paul would bear testimony for Jesus in Acts 23. What are those two major cities? Jerusalem and Rome, all right? Two major cities. Now, we already know when we study about Paul, he spent some time in Jerusalem. We can read Acts 22, and we can read Acts 24, we can read Acts 26, and we read about Paul standing before people like Festus and Agrippa and people like that, people who were leaders and appointed rulers in Judea and in Jerusalem. And so he testifies there, but that's earlier in his missionary work. He's also going to get the opportunity to testify in Rome. And when we study about the journeys of Paul, this is typically called the fourth journey. It's really just Paul's journey to Rome, because he appeals to Caesar after his arrest in Jerusalem, and he sails, takes a very long journey, so that he can appeal to Caesar in Rome. This is a map of Rome, and we asked this question last week when we studied about, what did we study about last week? Corinth. We studied about Corinth, and next week we're thinking about Ephesus. I get all these cities jumbled up in my mind because I'm usually working ahead on next week's, and I'm planning to do today's. And so as you take a look, though, at this map of Rome, what are some things that pop out in your mind that would tell us a little bit about what the culture's like there? They like to bathe. Indeed they do. You mentioned that, and let me read an excerpt to you from, again, Clinton Hamilton. He says, even today there are remains of the arches that supported the aqueducts that carried about 200 to 300 million gallons of water to the city daily. That was very impressive, one of the impressive features of Rome, the aqueducts that carry the water down from the hills into the city. The aqueducts were cement pipes. They were public baths and circuses, and these featured chariot races and athletic events. And so it was an entertainment-oriented city. A lot of people like to compare America today to the ancient Roman Empire because we're very entertainment-focused, just like the Romans were. We really like to have fun. We're also big into personal, the way that we look personally, and being clean. Not that that's a bad thing. But it was only in the villas of the wealthy that there were private baths. However, there were many free public baths in the city, and some of these even had brothels in connection with them. The city was dirty and congested, but the people were among the cleanest in the ancient world. Men and women bathed together. That was one of the things that they did that was common in Rome, all right, which would be another indication this is a very sexually provocative city. Now, you would think Paul would deal with some of that temptation to be very unchaste, and he does. If you look at Romans chapter 13, let's read verses 12 through 14 there, and that perhaps because that's part of the culture, it's why Paul's addressing what he does here in Romans 13, 12 through 14. He says, do this. Again, I'm reading from a New American Standard. Let's look at verse 12. The night is almost gone. Romans 13, verse 12. The night is almost gone. The day is near. So let's lay aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let's behave properly as in the day, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual promiscuity and sensuality, not in strife and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in regard to its lust. You go down to the baths, you go down to the brothels, you're making provision for the flesh. I think Paul's encouraging with those words, staying away from certain places where those temptations would have been common for Christians in Rome. All right, what else do you notice about Rome if you look at that? They like to bathe, they like to take their baths. Various temples, yes. In fact, Rome, they would invite the gods of various places to come and set up a temple in Rome. It's considered a very accepting city. Until, you were a Christian, And you started to speak out against those temples, and you started to speak out against those false gods. That's why Claudius probably sent a lot of the Christians out of Rome when Aquila and Priscilla are found in Acts chapter 18 in Corinth, because Claudius, if you read Suetonius, who's a Roman historian, he would say that it's the Christians who are causing a big disturbance in Rome, and so we kicked them out for a while. But clearly Aquila and Priscilla have come back later, because they're mentioned in Romans chapter 16 as being back in Rome. So that was only a temporary thing. But yeah, lots of temples, lots of idol worship, lots of idolatry in Rome. Anything else?
The Jewish quarter is bigger than I expected.
The Jewish quarter is bigger than you expected. All right. You got some water running through Rome. That's.
Well, the Jewish quarter is what I was talking about. But they've got them all really separated.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. All right. Lots of entertainment. Do you see the entertainment options there? Colosseum, the palaces, Circus Maximus, where you would have had various chariot races and things like that. The theater of Pompeii, things of that nature. That tells us a little bit about Rome just by looking at some of the architecture. The Praetorian Camp, which is on the northeast corner, that's probably where Paul would have gone when he would have walked into the city and walked up the Appian Way. Probably would have been there at the first. All right, so question 2. I don't think we're going to get through all our questions today. We've already studied about the church at Jerusalem, why it was a key city for the gospel's beginnings. What is it about Rome that made it an evangelical focal point in the first century and in the early days of Christianity's spread? Why would you want to? All roads lead to Rome. And if all roads lead to Rome, all roads lead out of Rome. And if we can get some people converted in Rome, we can get the gospel going out from there. And so that's important. You got people coming to you, and you got people perhaps who are going to take that gospel out as well. So good point. Paul writes his letter to Rome probably somewhere between 56 to 58 AD. What can we gather about these Christians from Romans chapter 1 and verse 8? If you read Romans 1 and verse 8, what do we learn about them from there? I'm going to switch Bibles up. This print is too small. I'm getting too old. Can't see things like I used to.
Apparently they're doing okay because their faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world.
All right, they seem to be doing okay. He compliments them from the beginning. Your faith has gone out to the whole world, and so he's appreciative of the Christians who are there. Is this only one local church in Rome when he writes to Rome? No, there's several, it would seem, local churches, because there's various ones that are mentioned meeting in houses in Rome, and so this letter perhaps is distributed to some of those Christians in Rome. Now, how might the church at Rome have had their beginning? It's a little bit of a mystery. We don't really get told that. On Paul's journeys, we don't see him in the book of Acts like we do with some of the other churches stopping in at Rome. He's only going there as a prisoner. So we know how it continued and maybe continued to grow, but how did it get started, perhaps?
Could have been that on Pentecost there were some Jews there that maybe weren't named in Acts, but there's a large Jewish contingent potentially. I'm sure there was some at Pentecost.
Yeah. On Pentecost in Acts 2, Rome is specifically mentioned as being one of the places that when people came from various nations and locales, they were there on Pentecost. So they were there when they heard Peter preach the first gospel sermon, and it's perhaps would have taken that back to Rome. Maybe not even directly. Maybe they stayed in Jerusalem for a while. We don't really know. But we do know that after the persecution that faced Stephen, that people began to disperse and leave Judea and began to go other places because of persecution. So maybe some went back to Rome at that time as well. Now, why does Paul want to go there? Why is he so insistent on wanting to be there? Other than it's a big city and he wants to preach and things like that. There's something he specifically mentions in Romans chapter 1, verse 11 through 15. What is he? He
wanted some gifts.
Yeah.
Spiritual gifts, not money and stuff.
Right. He wants to pass on spiritual gifts. So Romans 1:11 says, I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift so that you may be established. Now, we studied about Corinth last week. Did they have spiritual gifts? Yeah, they did. In fact, they're fighting over them. They have tons of spiritual gifts, and they're some are envious of the spiritual gifts that other people have. This is a very spiritually gifted church, but Rome has the opposite problem. Don't have those spiritual gifts, and so he says, I want to go there so that I can impart to you some spiritual gift. All right, so that's one of the reasons he wanted to go, so that they could be more well established than they were. This is what Long Henry writes in Churches of the New Testament. He says, the beginnings of the church in Rome are shrouded in mystery. We know that there was a church in Rome by 57 CE when Paul writes to the church there, and that had been there for some time. We are told that there are some from Rome present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, and it's likely that some such persons believed in Jesus on that day, became part of the church, and others returned to Rome sometime during the 30s. That the church in Rome, this is what McMurray writes in Studying New Testament Churches. He says that the church in Rome was working is evident from chapter 1 and verse 8, which is stated that their faith was being proclaimed throughout the whole world. From 16 and verse 19 we read that word of their obedience was reaching out to all. As well, 16 verse 5, verses 14 and 15 seems to record several congregations in this city meeting in homes. Their handicap, however, was the fact that no apostle had ever visited there, and no apostles meant there were no spiritual gifts given by laying on of the apostles' hands. The effect of their handicap, however, did not stop them from working. And I think that's encouraging too. They may not have been complete in the sense of having those spiritual gifts and completely established, but they're still working to try to spread the gospel as they can with the limited knowledge that they have. All right, in the days of Claudius Caesar, there were some Christians expelled from Rome, including Paul's friends, Priscilla and Aquila. You read about them in Acts 18. Where's one of the churches of Rome meeting by the time Paul writes his letter to the Romans? In the house of Aquila and Priscilla. So it seems as though they've gone back and are reestablished there. In fact, there's a group that is meeting with them in their home. So, this is the quote that I mentioned to you earlier from Suetonius, who wrote, because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, that's just a different way of spelling out Christ, he expelled them from the city. Claudius Caesar did not like the evangelistic nature of the Christians, and so he actually banished some of the what's called Jews here, but Jews who had converted to Christianity. All right. So in a large, diverse, powerful city such as Rome, what would you imagine would be some of the key cultural challenges for the church? Okay, so even Nero is mentioned as being involved in that. A lot of prostitution as well, because we've already mentioned that with the brothels and the public bathhouses. So that was common. So sexual immorality, common. What's that?
Emperor worship.
Emperor worship. With some of the emperors, there was emperor worship as well. Yes?
Well, there might have been a problem with reintegrating the Jews who came back into these predominant Gentile churches.
Yeah. So it's kind of a melting pot. And so you have people with the Jewish background, people with the Gentile background. And we're going to jump into that in a minute, because we're going to see that's really what one of the key goals of Romans is, trying to get Jew and Gentile to work together. People from a very different background. Grown up on the Old Testament, people who grew up knowing nothing about the Old Testament, grew up on, paganism and idolatry. Hard to get people with those two backgrounds to start working together as Christians. And so that would certainly be a challenge. It's a challenge to get older generation and sometimes younger generation working together. It's a challenge to get people who grew up with paper Bibles and kids that are growing up with Bibles on their iPhones working together. It can be difficult to get somebody from a denominational background working together with somebody who never grew up knowing anything about the church at all. And so we can learn some really good lessons from what Paul was trying to accomplish in Rome about how it takes time to work together and things that we should be shooting for as we work together. So Romans 1 through 12, if we were to just kind of give a quick overview of Romans, it's an intense theological treatise demonstrating a commonality between both Jews and Gentiles. Let me show you this next chart, and I think this is a good overview chart of really what Romans is all about. Now, the thesis passage of Romans, I think, is Romans 1, 16 and 17, where Paul says, "I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek." Okay, Paul is setting up, this is his thesis statement. In it, that's in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. That is, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. The gospel is how people learn how they can be made righteous by God through Jesus Christ. And so if we were to just kind of break down Romans really quickly, there's a common, if you look at the center column there, there's just something that's a commonality. All right, he starts out in verses 18, chapter 1, verse 18, all the way through chapter 3. His real theme is the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Well, who is ungodly and who's unrighteous? Well, the Gentiles are, Romans 1 says. But what about the Jews? Romans 2 says a lot of the Jews are hypocrites. They teach things that they themselves aren't practicing. So what's the ultimate point? Romans 3, verse 23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Doesn't matter if you're a Jew, doesn't matter if you're Gentile. We are all falling short of God's glory, and so therefore we are in need of His grace, and we are in need of being justified by Him. And so that's one of the goals of Romans 3:21 through chapter 4:24 is that you can be justified. Who can be justified? Both Jew and Gentile. How? By faith in Jesus Christ. Who's that for? Well, God's plan is for all. Romans 4:23 through Romans 5:21 is that, God wanted both Jew and Gentile to be saved through Jesus Christ. And how am I saved through Jesus Christ? Well, I have to die to myself. Romans 6, 7, 8 is all about dying to sin, dying to the law, dying to the flesh. And I have to start living in newness of life for the sake of Jesus Christ. And it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or a Gentile, you got to have the same goals. I'm going to die to me, and I'm going to start living for Jesus. We talk about the choice of God's plan, that He wanted to graft in the Gentiles with the Jews as all part of the same tree in Romans 9, 10, 11. And that makes up the children of promise, the people to whom the promises that were originally made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are delivered. And so what do we have to do? Whether Jew or Gentile, you got to be a living sacrifice. And so chapters 12, 13, 14, 15 are all just the application of the real goal of Romans, which is letting everyone see you're all sinners, you all need Jesus, and so you've got to start all living and working together for Jesus. And if we're going to cover Romans in one class, that's the best way I can do it. All right. So, in a church full of diversity of people and abilities, what are some of the key lessons from Romans 12 for those who would want to be fruitful in the body of Christ? You guys see anything in Romans 12 that popped out to you as you were working on your lessons? Don't be conformed to the world, okay? We've got to make sure we're conforming to the image of Jesus. Not everybody does the same thing. So in a church where you got a lot of different people, a lot of different backgrounds, you need to understand not everybody does the same thing. Different people do different things, have different abilities. So don't be arrogant if you do something that somebody else doesn't do. Don't let that make you be haughty, as if your role is better or you are more important than someone else. We're all part of the same body. We just have different roles in that body. What else do you see in Romans 12? Patience. We need to be patient with one another. Be humble. It's a sense of humility. Hospitality is emphasized. That's going to be important in a church where you get all these different backgrounds. Let's be hospitable to each other. Let's welcome people from different backgrounds. That's going to help us build together. Okay. Do you see that? I agree with you, but where do you get that idea from Romans 12? Okay. All right. So good. So we got some morals. I think Romans 13 to me would be the closest to that, where he says, "Don't walk in lewdness and lust, or in strife or envy." There's a certain way we shouldn't act, and immodesty, I think, could fit into that category, perhaps. All right. Anything else? Be at peace with each other. Yeah, at some point somebody's going to maybe irritate you or make you mad. Don't try to overcome evil with evil. Overcome evil with good. And so that's important as well. All right. This is some of the things that Long Henry mentions in his book. All Christians are to be as living and holy sacrifices, not conforming to the world. Christians must not think of themselves too highly, realize they function within a greater whole, described in terms of a body. Each one is expected to use the gifts he has been given. Okay? Christians are to abhor the evil, cling to the good, love each other, look out for their interests, take care of their needs. They're to bless those who persecute them, be at peace with all men as much as it depends on them. In all things, good should conquer evil. So these are some good suggestions. Now, we get to Romans 13. In a city that had its fair share of power-hungry rulers and soldiers, and not all of whom were moral and ethical, how would Romans 13 have been a transformative and unifying instructive for Rome? What are they taught there? You got to submit to your rulers.
Every person.
Everybody. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities. No exceptions. It could be difficult, especially when some of the rulers weren't always great guys. Mm-hmm.
I think it would be good for them, like it is for us, to know that it really doesn't matter what's going on in the world. You know, God's in control, and it's going to be good for us. And whatever happens in our country is nothing compared to heaven and God.
Okay. All right. Good. What else would you have? Romans 13. Love for everyone. There's a T words in Romans 13, I'm pretty sure. Pay your taxes. Right. Yep. I mean, I would imagine that there's a few Christians out there who are thinking, well, I got to pay my taxes. They're just building more Circus Maximuses and building Colosseums where eventually they're just going to have gladiator fights and things like that. I mean, I have to pay my tax. Yep. Pay your taxes. Yep. There's some good things to do with those taxes. You may not agree with everything to do with those taxes, but you got to pay your taxes. So there's a few things there, I think, in Romans 13 that are instructive. Well, we get to Romans 14. And a church is made up of Jews and Gentiles. You got new Christians, you got seasoned Christians, some that would be considered strong, some that would be considered weak. What principles in Romans 14 would have been especially important for Rome to succeed together as you walk through there?
Said it's a mixture in those churches in Rome of Jewish people and Gentile people. So learning how to figure out what is a matter of faith that we need to discuss and what's just a matter of opinion.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We can be unified and continue moving forward with it.
Mm-hmm. Good. Don't bind your opinions on somebody else. I think that's taught there in Romans 14 and 15.
There are some cultural and social matters that should not be issues of touch.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure that Ed could tell us many cultural matters that he's come across in his overseas work.
Eating chicken
Eating chicken livers?
innards.
Oh, yeah. Eating chicken innards. But if somebody sets them in front of you, what do?
You do it.
You do it. Yeah. Why? Because you don't want to offend that brother who's trying to be hospitable towards you. So you eat chicken innards. All right. You guys just got to have Ed over for dinner sometime, because I bet Ed can tell you a bunch of stories. Yep. Don't be judgmental towards other people, towards their eating habits, because they're different than yours. Don't let that become a stumbling block. There's a lot of things in here. He mentions a lot of things just in this quick paragraph. He says, Christians should resolve not to put a stumbling block in another person's way. Verse 13, there is liberty in matters of food and drink. It's not good to do anything by which your brother stumbles. Verse 21, Christians should watch lest they be condemned in what they approve. Christians should act only by faith, for what is not of faith is sin. Paul indicates the responsibility of brethren who are stronger to bear with and build up the weak brethren, seeking the best for each other as Christ did for all. There's just some principles. They're going to help us to get along better in Romans 14 and 15. And sometimes we really can get, when you study through Romans, if you're in a Bible class, you study Romans, we really get bogged down in a lot of details. That's important sometimes. Sometimes it's good to just see a bird's eye view. What's Paul trying to accomplish? Big picture view in Rome. He's trying to get people who are Jews and Gentiles with different backgrounds to learn how to get along with each other. And it's important to emphasize and see that. In Romans 15, there's some principles that I think would be vitally helpful. I'm going to skip over that. Let's look at Romans 16, because I've only got a couple minutes left. I just want you to see this. You've got a city that's got new, successful people. They're commonly bringing in new ideas. Why would the warning of Romans 16, 17 through 19 also be important in the church? Take a look at it. I'm going to read Romans 16, verse 17. I urge you, brethren, note those who cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which you learned, and avoid them. Those who are such do not serve our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by smooth words and flattering speech deceive the hearts of the simple. Your obedience has become known to all. Therefore, I'm glad on your behalf, but I want you to be wise in what is good and simple concerning evil. Do you think there were people coming from other places who were bringing in false teaching, false doctrine? So he says, I also want you to be aware of that. And I want you to not listen to somebody who's going to teach you something other than what you've learned. Be careful about that. All right?
It's interesting how many people Paul knew about. The last chapter says, greet so-and-so. He has kinspeople there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a wide variety of friends who live there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Romans 16 is full of a list of names. And I love Romans 16 because, if anything, it's Paul proving I didn't do everything alone. I have a lot of friends who have helped me out along the way and who have been friends to me, and that's been important to them as well. Okay. Paul felt compelled to warn. I think that's important for us to know as we look at Romans. Now, Paul makes it to Rome to appeal to Caesar. When you read the last chapter of Acts 28, that's about his final destination. At least when we get to the end of Acts, I think he was released from Rome, and then he would have died just a few years later. But on this trip to Rome, how'd it go, this first trip in Acts 28? Somebody summarize. He's teaching the Jews first and the Gentiles. He's able to preach to people while he's a prisoner. And he's having success. And that's great. You mentioned yesterday in the Bible read at the park, Mel, you mentioned, I think there was a note about somebody in Caesar's household. Clearly, Paul had success teaching some people perhaps who were in Caesar's household while he was in Rome. That's important too. We could have also looked at Peter. Peter mentions Babylon in the end of one of his letters. I think it's 2 Peter. A lot of people would argue that the Babylon he's referring to is Rome. So Peter has a Rome connection as well. In fact, Paul and Peter both die eventually, according to history, in Rome. All right. Thanks for your attention. I've got lessons. I'm going to put these in the back